Welcome to the Quantum Business Book Club. We will finish this year looking at some of the Western world's favorite fantasy fiction novels, because these authors and these creators and these visionaries saw what was possible. I call it quantum business because every page I open bends time. I can sit across the table from genius like Huxley, Tolkien, and Le Guin. I can trade notes with minds who built entire realities during collapse. And now you are invited to join me. Each of these books reshaped how I lead, create, and play the long game. For me, reading isn't consumption. It's also not distraction. It helps me play the game to win. In fact, these books allow me to be the game designer. So this season is our fantasy and magic series, The Myth Makers of Revolution. Every time the world industrializes, someone rediscovers magic. I'm Nicole VZ, and this is your field manual for founders and CEOs, creative visionaries, artists, leaders, and those of you willing to build something amidst the destruction. This is the next age of business in the wreckage of the last. Each week, we will pull a thread from writers who faced war, tyranny, and mechanization and turned them into myth. They built the map to hope. From Soviet satire to celestial wonder, we decode the leadership patterns that kept humanity awake inside the darkness. This isn't nostalgia. This is navigation. Welcome. Hey, welcome back. Whenever you're listening to this, happy day. If you're listening to this in real time, happy Gregorian calendar New Year. It should be the first episode of 2026 and the actual last episode of the Fantasy Saves the World series. If you don't know what I'm talking about, hit that rewind button on this podcast 7 times and then you will know. The introduction probably filled you in, and we will be returning to our regular programming, whatever the fuck that means after this. And I wanted to bring a lightness, a levity, a whimsy to this episode because this movie, there's so much about this particular story that both captured me and destroyed me and inspired me and created me and crafted me into the believer that I am today. You know, the world is still a dumpster fire out there, and bringing any of that energy into anything feels challenging. And then I have my own personal experience that continues to surprise me in new and amazing ways. And I'm just so grateful for the learning opportunities. But I am most importantly and most appreciative of you, because you're here with me right now. And that's why I love reading and the Quantum Book Club and podcasts, is that it allows us to time travel and be in this moment together in real time right now, wherever in the world you may be, whatever time it might be for you. Our space-time continuums just intersected, my friend, and that's pretty fucking cool. So without further delay, let's talk about this book that creeped in very unexpectedly, potentially breaking the rules, not really even in rhythmic patterning that I appreciate. To throw this one at the end as the first of the next year doesn't fulfill any plan that I had, that's for sure. But here we are, walking the walk together. And this segue will be anything but smooth. But I digress. No one destroys the world on purpose. They just stop participating. They stop believing they're responsible for what happens next. They disengage emotionally and call it pragmatism, realism, responsible. That's how they learn to survive without caring. And that's how the Neverending Story begins. Not with a war, not with a villain, but with absence. Michael Ende called the absence the nothing. And he didn't invent it as fantasy. Ende wrote this book in late 1970s West Germany in a culture that had technically rebuilt itself and psychologically hollowed itself out. The cities were standing again, the economy was functioning, but the inner world had been sealed off. After World War II, imagination was dangerous terrain. It had been used once already, manipulated, weaponized, turned into ideology. So adults learned a new survival strategy. Be practical, be restrained, don't feel too much, don't believe too deeply, grow out of fantasy. Ende grew up watching this happen. His father, Edgar Ende, was a surrealist painter whose work had been labeled degenerate by the Nazis and destroyed. As a child, Michael Ende saw firsthand what happens when society decides imagination is a threat rather than a responsibility. So when the war ended, he noticed something chilling. The regime was gone, but the numbness remained. That numbness is what the Neverending Story is really about. The nothing doesn't conquer Fantasia. It spreads wherever people withdraw their care, their curiosity, their willingness to believe that inner life shapes outer reality. Fantasia isn't defeated. It is abandoned. And Fantasia isn't just a fantasy land in this book. It's the inner ecosystem of meaning itself. The place where stories, symbols, values, and futures are born. The layer of reality that answers the question, why does any of this matter? When Fantasia collapses, life doesn't stop. It just becomes thinner, transactional, efficient, emotionally manageable. Modern psychology now has a language for what Ende was describing. When people disengage from imagination, they don't become rational, they become rigid. Studies in psychology and neuroscience show that imaginative engagement is directly tied to emotional regulation, empathy, and adaptability. When imagination atrophies, people grow more cynical, more authoritarian, curious, more disconnected from agency. And they didn't have that data. He had intuition and he trusted it. This brings us to Bastian Balthazar Bucks, a boy who is lonely, bullied, grieving his mother, and largely invisible to the adults around him. Not because they're cruel, but because they've lost access to the world he lives in, inside. Bastian isn't weak. He's sensitive in a culture that rewards numbness. So he does what sensitive people have always done when the world offers no refuge. He finds a story. He steals a book. He hides in an attic and he reads. Yeah, that got me. At first, this looks like escape, but the Neverending Story is not about escaping the world. It's about what happens when imagination becomes the last place responsibility still exists. Fantasia is dying. The childlike empress is ill. Heroes are failing. Quests unravel. Not because courage is gone, but because the world requires something it can no longer generate on its own. Participation, belief, presence. Fantasia cannot save itself without someone from the human world stepping inside. And this is where Ende makes his most radical move. The story begins speaking to Bastian. The reader realizes the reader is being read. The boundary between observer and participant dissolves. The question shifts. Not what happens next, but will you participate? This is the first truth the Neverending Story delivers without flinching. Worlds don't collapse because of evil. They collapse when people decide they don't belong to them anymore. The opposite of destruction isn't control, it's participation. Participation isn't harmless. When Bastian enters Fantasia, the world is reborn and immediately the cost appears. Each wish reshapes reality and erases something of him in return. Each act of creation costs a memory. Each surge of admiration pulls him further from his center. Each transformation distances him from his grief, his origin, even his name. Ende was deeply suspicious of imagination without grounding. He believed fantasy without return was as dangerous as obedience without conscience. Every author in this series would agree, and so does research. Creativity unanchored from identity often turns into domination, disassociation, or burnout. Vision without remembrance destabilizes the self. Ende encoded that warning into the story itself. This isn't a children's book. It's a field manual for creators, leaders, and builders living in a world where disengagement is rewarded and participation feels risky. The Neverending Story asks a question most cultures avoid. How do you stay inside the story without losing yourself? How do you imagine boldly without disappearing into what you create? How do you participate fully and still come home with your name intact? That's what we're going to be talking about in this episode. This journey is about the danger of withdrawal, the responsibility of imagination, and the discipline of participation. Because the fastest way to destroy a world isn't to attack it, it's to no longer give a shit. The nothing isn't evil, it's withdrawal. Every story in this series has a machine. It's becoming redundant. I know. In A Brave New World, it was pleasure without purpose. In 1984, it was fear without truth. In The Little Prince, it was efficiency without heart. In The Neverending Story, the machine is quieter and more polite, more acceptable, more deadly. Michael Ende didn't imagine a tyrant or an army or a weapon. He imagined the nothing. And the nothing is not destruction, it is disengagement. The nothing spreads wherever people stop participating in meaning, not where they disagree, but where they rebel. When they quietly decide that imagination is childish, belief is naive, and caring too much is unsafe. That's what makes this book unsettling. There isn't a villain to defeat. There's no ideology to overthrow. There's only absence. This is why intention is everything. When you rebel, when you abandon yourself, your beliefs, your engagement, Fantasia isn't dying because someone hated it or destroyed it. It's dying because no one feels responsible for it anymore. And it was precise about this. The nothing advances wherever humans abandon their inner lives, where they outsource meaning to systems, where they become spectators instead of participants. And this is where the book stops being fantasy and starts being a prescription, a diagnosis, where modern psychology confirms what Ende intuited long ago, was people disengage from imagination because of responsibility. They don't become rational, they become rigid. Studies in cognitive science show that imaginative engagement strengthens psychological flexibility, empathy, and moral reasoning. When imagination atrophies, people grow more brittle, more reactive, more susceptible to authoritarian thinking, and burn out. In other words, imagination isn't decorative, it's stabilizing. The nothing looks like maturity. It sounds like that's just how the world works. Don't get your hopes up. Be realistic. Fantasy won't fix anything. Or is, as my dad liked to say, don't hope, because then you can never be disappointed. The nothing doesn't shout. It shrugs. And that shrug is contagious because disengagement feels safer than hope. Detached observation feels smarter than participation. Cynicism feels like protection until it hollows everything out. Fantasia is the inner ecosystem of meaning. It's where stories give shape to values, where symbols organize reality, where purpose is born before it becomes policy or product. When Fantasia collapses, systems still function. People still go to work, markets still move, technology still scales, but the why disappears. Life becomes transactional. Culture becomes ironic. Leadership becomes extractive. Does this sound familiar? It's not dystopia yet. It's burnout at scale. That's why we're talking about this right now, my friend. That's why we had to do this book. And they saw this forming in post-war Europe. A generation learned to survive catastrophe by numbing imagination, and it worked. The cities were rebuilt, but the inner world was left unattended. Meaning was treated as dangerous, fantasy as indulgent, feeling deeply as irresponsible. So people learned to read stories without entering them, to consume without committing, to comment without creating. That is the machine, not control, not coercion, withdrawal. And this is the uncomfortable truth the never-ending story insists on. Worlds don't collapse when people imagine too much. They collapse when people stop imagining at all. Not the chaotic imagination of delusion, but the participatory imagination that says, if I care about this, I am responsible for it. Then nothing is what happens when responsibility for meaning is abdicated, when imagination is outsourced to entertainment, when belief is replaced by irony, when participation is replaced by commentary. This is why Fantasia needs a human child, not a warrior, not a strategist, not a genius, someone who still feels accountable for what they imagine, someone who hasn't learned to disengage yet, someone who hasn't mistaken detachment for wisdom. The machine of the Neverending Story teaches us something brutal but useful. The greatest threat to any system is not rebellion. It's apathy. Because apathy doesn't trigger defenses. It doesn't look dangerous. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly stops feeding the thing that keeps worlds alive. This is where the book turns the mirror on us. Because we live in an era of unprecedented spectatorship. We watch more than we participate. We critique more than we commit. We optimize more than we imagine. We call it being informed. We call it being realistic. We call it being grown up. Ende calls it the nothing. Once you see the machine, you can't unsee it, not in this book. And Ende refuses to let the reader stay safe. He refuses to allow observation to be enough. And he forces the question, will you participate? Will you enter the story, or will you watch Fantasia disappear? This is where the Neverending Story stops being diagnostic and prescriptive. It starts becoming confrontational. Michael Ende doesn't let you stay a reader. He doesn't let you analyze the collapse from a safe distance. He doesn't let you critique Fantasia as if it's someone else's problem. He breaks the spell of spectatorship. The book turns around and literally asks you, will you enter, or are you going to keep watching? At the beginning, Bastian does exactly what modern culture trains us to do. He consumes the story, he hides in it, he uses it to survive. And at first, this looks reasonable. He's bullied, he's grieving his mother, he's emotionally unattended by a father drowning in his own loss. Fantasy becomes the refuge. Can you relate? But Ende is very careful here. Refuge isn't the same as participation. Reading alone will not save Fantasia, and Fantasia will die while it's just being observed. That's the first mythic inversion. Stories don't survive because they're consumed or even retold. They survive because someone steps inside and takes responsibility for them, for what is unleashed. And that's where the Neverending Story steps into our day-to-day. Because we're living in a moment of extreme consumption and minimal participation. We read, we scroll, we react, we share, but we hesitate to really participate. And the data is blunt about the cost of that. A 2023 Pew Research report showed that while digital engagement is at an all-time high, civic participation, trust, and a sense of agency are at historic lows. People are informed, but they are not involved. Another study from the American Psychological Association found that passive information consumption correlates with higher anxiety, lower perceived control, and increased burnout. Active participation correlates with resilience and meaning. Fantasia doesn't die because people don't know what's happening. It dies because they don't believe their participation matters. That's why the childlike empress cannot heal herself. Not because she's weak, but because the system itself requires an outside participant. Someone who hasn't outsourced meaning yet. Someone who still believes that imagination carries obligation. That's why the book needs a child. Not because children are innocent, but because they still live in this participatory, imaginative state. Children don't watch stories, they inhabit them. Adults, by contrast, are trained to remain observers. We're taught to comment, not commit, to critique, not embody, to analyze instead of enter into relationship, to optimize instead of become. It's not wisdom, it's just conditioning. So when Bastian finally enters Fantasia, something extraordinary happens. The nothing retreats. The world begins to repair, to grow, and creation resumes. And for a brief moment, the book looks like it's celebrating imagination as salvation. But Ende refuses the easy ending. Imagination, once activated, becomes power, and power always tests the self. So here's where the never-ending story becomes dangerous. Every wish Bastian makes reshapes Fantasia. Every wish costs him a memory, not a random memory, a core memory, his mother, his name, his grief, his origin. It's not a metaphorical flourish. This is Ende encoding a psychological truth we now have decades of research to support. Creativity unanchored from identity destabilizes the self. So studies in neuroscience and psychology show that when people pursue external validation, power, or recognition without internal coherence, they experience increased disassociation, narcissistic defenses, and burnout. A 2021 study in Nature Human Behavior found that individuals who chase status-based rewards at the expense of self-integration show reduced empathy, impaired self-reflection, and higher volatility under stress. That's Bastian. He doesn't become evil, he becomes unmoored. And this is the mythic warning modern culture desperately needs. Because right now, we are living through a mass experiment in imagination without anchoring. AI-generated worlds, influence without accountability, creation without return, visibility without integration. We are producing faster than we are remembering. We are building identities optimized for admiration, not truth. And the psychological consequences are everywhere. Burnout, identity confusion. I mean, like our internal, individualized identities. No externalized physical identities, just for the record. Rage and these cycles of violence and abuse, moral exhaustion. And this isn't because we're weak. It's because we are creating without a return path, without an anchor. It's kind of what Tolkien was going on about. Like it's unlimited imagination. It's scale at all costs. It is the ends justify the means. And Ende saw this coming. He did not believe imagination was automatically liberating. He believed imagination without remembrance becomes domination. The power that corrupts. That's why Bastian starts rewriting Fantasia to reflect his unmet needs. He wants to be admired, to be feared. He wants to be important. Each wish makes him more impressive and less himself. This isn't a villain arc. It's an unintegrated creator arc. And it mirrors what leadership research now confirms. A massive Harvard Business Review meta-analysis of leadership failures found that the most destructive leaders were not incompetent or malicious, but high-capacity individuals whose inner identity could not keep pace with their expanding influence. Sound familiar? Talent scaled faster than self-knowledge. Power outran integration. Fantasia breaks when imagination is no longer tethered to the truth. This is why the Neverending Story, and I might argue all of these books aren't fantasy. They are disembodied realities. And he is not telling us to stop imagining. He's telling us to enter into imagination with responsibility and then come back. It's like the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Bring what has been discovered back. Remember who we are while we build. Refuse the lie that creation must cost us everything. It must cost us who we are. And this is where the myth turns back towards us, because we are living in a moment where attention is monetized, imagination is industrialized, identity is performative, participation feels risky, and withdrawal is rewarded and even considered sophisticated. The cultural script says care less, detach, protect yourself, don't get too invested. Ende says that's how the nothing spreads. The myth of the Neverending Story insists on a harder truth. You cannot save a world you refuse to enter, and you cannot enter a world without risking yourself. You also can't stay if you forget who you are. That's the paradox. Participation requires courage. Creation requires memory. Power requires return. And this is the hinge of the entire book. This is why this episode had to happen and hits so hard right now. The real crisis of our time is not lack of information. It's lack of grounded participation. We don't need more takes. We need more people willing to step inside the story, build with care, and come back with their names intact. In Fantasia, imagination creates reality. But imagination isn't free. Every act of creation carries a cost. Every wish requires an exchange. Every expansion demands integration. Bastian doesn't lose memories by accident. He loses them because creation without return fractures identity. This is the central insight. Creation without identity leads to disassociation. Bastian's problem is not that he imagines too much. It's that he imagines without grounding. Each wish pulls him further into performance, further into admiration, further into power, and further away from himself. This mirrors what psychology now calls identity diffusion. Research in clinical psychology shows that when people pursue external goals like status, recognition, or control without internal coherence, the psyche compensates by fragmenting. The result is not confidence, it's volatility. A 2020 study in clinical psychological science found that individuals who prioritize external validation over internal values experience reduced self-concept clarity, higher disassociation under stress, and increased reactivity and defensiveness. That's Bastian mapped clinically. He becomes impressive, powerful, and unrecognizable to himself. Fantasia doesn't corrupt him, but imagination actually does. And one of the most brutal truths hidden in this book is that Bastian gains power faster than he gains self-knowledge. This is where the danger lives, in this gap. Modern leadership research confirms this pattern across industries. A large-scale analysis of leadership derailment found that the most damaging leaders were not malicious or incompetent. We already said this. These high-capacity individuals whose influence outpaced their emotional and ethical integration. Talent scaled, but they didn't. And they encoded this as truth, and then encoded this truth as myth. The more Bastian is admired, the less he remembers who he is. The more the world bends to his will, the less grounded he becomes. That's not imagination failing. That's a failure of this anchoring, of this integration, of this groundedness. Memory is the anchor of meaning. Why memory? Why does Ende make memory the cost? Because memory isn't nostalgic, it is identity continuity, according to Ende. Neuroscience shows that memory is the mechanism that allows the self to remain coherent over time. Without it, the brain can still function, but the person fractures. Studies in neuropsychology demonstrate that memory integrates emotion, values, and meaning into decision-making. When memory is impaired or suppressed, people become more impulsive, less empathetic, and more susceptible to dominance behaviors. Ende wasn't being poetic, he was being precise. When Bastian forgets his mother, his grief, his pain, his name, he doesn't become free, he becomes hollow. That is the cost of creation without remembrance. And I really appreciate this, especially when you layer it with every book that we've read. Imagination is a force, not a virtue. This is where the Neverending Story quietly dismantles modern self-help culture. Imagination isn't automatically good. Creativity is not automatically healing. Vision is not automatically ethical. Imagination is amplifying. It magnifies whatever is unresolved in the person wielding it. If imagination is rooted in grief, it must pass through grief. If imagination is rooted in insecurity, it will externalize insecurity. If imagination is rooted in avoidance, it will build elaborate worlds to justify avoidance. That's why Bastian's wishes become increasingly self-serving, not because he's bad, because he's unintegrated. He lacks coherence. He doesn't remember his why. He's not anchored. Ende is warning us. Fantasy does not save the world, but integrated imagination can. Most fantasy ends with ascension. The hero saves the world. But Ende concludes the never-ending story with this anchoring, this return to choice is everything. In psychological terms, return is integration. In mythic terms, return is initiation completed. In leadership terms, return is responsibility. Bastian must come back to the human world. He must reclaim his body, his grief, his limits, his name. Only then does imagination become sustainable. This aligns directly with research on creativity and resilience. Studies on long-term creative performance so that the most impactful creators maintain strong identity anchors outside their work. When identity collapses into output, burnout, and ethical drift follow. Ende encoded this as myth. You can enter the story, you can shape the world, but you must return. Otherwise, creation consumes the creator. So this is the architecture, the blueprint, the map the Neverending Story offers us. Imagination creates worlds. Identity anchors imagination. Memory preserves identity. Power tests integration. And return completes creation. If you remove any one of these, the system collapses. Fantasia doesn't die because imagination exists. Fantasia dies when imagination untethers. Right now, we are living in an era of accelerated creation, amplified influence, algorithmic imagination, identity as performance with minimal return. People are creating faster than they are integrating, building faster than they are remembering, and scaling before they are stable, let alone sustainable. This is why burnout feels existential now, why people lose themselves inside success, why systems rot from the inside out. Ende saw the pattern early, and he wrote the antidote in story form. You can participate without disappearing. And here is the Never-Ending Story's how-to. Because it could have stopped at the myth, at the fantasy, and it would have been beautiful. But Ende takes it further. He gives us this practice. And it's not a checklist or a doctrine. It's, I believe, a way of being inside imagination without losing yourself to it. It's not a solution. It's an experiment. My favorite. And again, the perfect kickoff to 2026. Participation over spectatorship. So the first experiment is deceptively simple. Stop watching the story you're meant to enter. The nothing feeds on consumption. It grows when people say, I'm just watching, I'm just observing, I'm just staying informed, I'm consuming. But Ende is ruthless about this. Fantasia does not respond to awareness. It responds to participation. And modern data will back it up. Studies in behavioral psychology show that passive engagement increases anxiety and helplessness, while active participation increases agency and psychological resilience, even if things feel uncertain, even if outcomes are unknown. Meaning doesn't come from certainty, it comes from involvement. So here's your experiment, my friend. What are you consuming instead of embodying right now? Where are you watching conversations instead of having them? Where are you following movements instead of joining them? Optimizing knowledge instead of taking a step that costs you something. Participation doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. And presence will always create change. The second experiment is easy to skip over. Create without forgetting why you started. Bastian loses himself not because he imagines wildly, but because he imagines selectively. He keeps the parts of himself that win admiration and sheds the parts that carry grief, doubt, and vulnerability. That's not fantasy. That's modern success culture. Research in identity psychology shows that when people suppress core aspects of themselves to maintain performance or approval, they experience identity fragmentation and emotional burnout. The practice here is remembrance. Before you create, ask, what part of me is not allowed into this work? Grief, tenderness, uncertainty, anger, love. If your imagination excludes your truth, it will eventually turn against you. The goal is not to be impressive here. The goal is just to be coherent. Build return paths into everything. This is experiment number 3. This is Ende's most radical contribution. Every fantasy story teaches us about ascension. It's the modern success myth, right? But Ende teaches us return. The experiment is, will you return? Where is your return path? In your work, in your leadership, in your relationships, in your creative life, return paths can look like rhythms that bring you back into your body, regulation, relationships that you knew before you were successful, practices that reconnect you to your grief, to your limits, to your humanity, places where you were not performing. Neuroscience confirms what myth always knew. Integration happens in cycles, not straight lines. Without return, the nervous system stays in expansion mode. That's not growth, that's overload. And they didn't warn us against dreaming big. He warned us against never coming home. So these experiments aren't about self-improvement. They're just about maintenance, about self-maintenance, but world maintenance. Fantasia doesn't need heroes. It needs participants who remember themselves. The world doesn't collapse because people fail. It collapses because people step back, fragment, and disappear into performance. Participation keeps worlds alive. Memory keeps people whole. Return keeps imagination sustainable. This episode isn't trying to fix something. It is asking you to notice, to pay attention. Where are you watching instead of engaging? Where are you creating without remembering? Why are you expanding without returning? That awareness alone weakens the nothing. Because the moment you remember you belong in the story, you change how it ends. So I want to close this episode in this series the way Ende closed the book. Not with advice, not with triumph, but with 3 quiet truths I think you've been waiting to hear. They don't instruct, they simply recognize. They're ready for you when you're ready to finish the book. Michael Ende doesn't end the never-ending story with a victory, but with recognition. Bastian does not save the world by becoming powerful. He saves it by remembering who he is and choosing to come home. And in that quiet return, the book leaves us, not with a manual or morals, but with truths. A world can only survive if someone feels responsible for it. Fantasia doesn't need consensus. It doesn't need efficiency. It doesn't even need hope. It just needs belonging. The nothing retreats the moment someone decides this matters enough for me to step in. Not because they're certain, not because they're qualified, but because they're willing. This is the truth modern culture keeps avoiding. Systems don't collapse from lack of intelligence. They collapse from lack of ownership. When no one feels responsible, everything erodes quietly. But the moment someone enters the story, even imperfectly, the future cracks open again. Imagination is not escape, it is obligation. This is the one people miss. Imagination is not a refuge from reality. It is a force, and it reshapes reality, whether you mean it to or not. It's why we anchor it with memory. Every vision you hold alters the world you move through. Every story you believe reorganizes your choices. Every dream carries consequence. Bastian's mistake wasn't wishing. It was wishing without remembering. Imagination asks for something in return: attention, care, truth. If you imagine without integrity, imagination will hollow you out. If you imagine with remembrance, imagination will rebuild your world. Last, you don't disappear because you fail. You disappear because you forget yourself while succeeding. That is the quietest truth and the most dangerous. Bastian doesn't lose himself when things go wrong. He loses himself when things go right. When he's admired, when he's powerful, when the world responds. Success without anchoring is disintegration in slow motion. Ende leaves us with this warning almost whispered. If you want to shape the world, you must know who is shaping it. Memory isn't a luxury. It is the tether that keeps creation from consuming the creator. This story does something extraordinary, I think. It sends Bastian home, not smaller, not ashamed, but he returns with this imagination he can bring into the real world where it belongs. The goal was never to live in Fantasia. It was to learn how to live here. The never-ending story, and even I am not asking you to save the world. We're asking something harder. Can you participate? What if caring costs you something? Will you participate even if there's no guarantee of applause? Will you imagine without abandoning yourself? The world doesn't end when things fall apart. It's not ending right now. But it might if we decide it's no longer our story to imagine. If you're still listening, if something stirred in you throughout this entire journey, you are remembering. That's recognition. You aren't meant to watch this story. You're meant to enter it. See you on the other side, my friend. Thank you for being here. Thank you for playing. Thank you for participating. Thank you for remembering. And most importantly, thank you for imagining.